The studio lights dimmed for just a moment, but in Steve Harvey's eyes the world had stopped completely. Because what this 17-year-old boy had just confessed would shatter everything he thought he knew about family, sacrifice, and the power of unconditional love, forcing America's most beloved game show host to make a decision that would change television history forever. It was supposed to be just another Tuesday afternoon taping of Family Feud at the CBS studios in Los Angeles, where the October sun streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor where countless families had stood before, hoping to win enough money to change their lives. The familiar energy buzzed through the air, that electric combination of nervous excitement, camera crew efficiency, and the anticipatory hum of an audience ready to cheer for strangers who would become, for 30 minutes, the most important people in their world. Steve Harvey, resplendent in his signature navy suit with the perfectly pressed lapels and his mustache groomed to television-ready perfection, was going through his pre-show routine with the practiced ease of a man who had mastered the art of making families feel comfortable under the harsh glare of studio lights and the pressure of live television. The Williams family from Detroit had been selected after an exhaustive application process that had taken 8 months, involving background checks, personality assessments, and multiple interviews designed to find families who could bring both entertainment value and authentic American stories to the screen. They were 5 generations of teachers, factory workers, small business owners, and community volunteers who had scraped together enough money for the cross-country trip to California, pooling resources from grandparents' Social Security checks, teenagers' part-time job earnings, and carefully saved vacation money. Standing at the contestant podium, representing not just his family but carrying hopes that extended far beyond the studio walls, was 17-year-old Marcus Williams, the youngest contestant the show had ever featured in its decades-long run. His grandmother, Eleanor Williams, a 72-year-old retired elementary school teacher with silver hair, pulled back in an elegant bun, and wearing her best church dress for the occasion, had insisted that Marcus be included despite his age, claiming with the prophetic wisdom that only grandmothers possessed that Marcus had an old soul and wisdom beyond his years that would surprise everyone who met him. What Eleanor Williams didn't know, what none of the producers or casting directors had discovered during their extensive vetting process, was just how prophetic those words would prove to be, and how her grandson's presence on that stage would create a moment of television that would be remembered not for its entertainment value, but for its raw humanity, and the way it would strip away the polished veneer of show business to reveal something profound and transformative about the human spirit. Under pressure. If you're watching this story unfold and feeling that same chill running down your spine that Steve Harvey felt in that moment, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because stories like this remind us why human connection matters more than anything else in this world. Drop a comment below about a time when someone surprised you with their strength, and click that hype button to help us share these powerful moments with even more people who need to hear them. Your support helps us deliver content that truly makes a difference in people's lives, and every subscription brings us closer to reaching families like the Williams who need their stories told. Marcus Williams stood barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, his school uniform, a white button-down shirt and navy slacks from the Detroit Public Schools district, slightly wrinkled from the nervous fidgeting he'd been doing throughout the morning as reality set in that he was actually standing on a television set, about to compete for money that could genuinely change his family's circumstances. His dark brown eyes, inherited from his late father, held a depth and maturity that seemed inconsistent with his youthful face, which still carried traces of the boy he had been before life circumstances forced him to grow up faster than any teenager should. When Steve Harvey approached him during the pre-game family introductions, following the show's time-honored tradition of making each contestant feel welcomed and valued, something stirred in the veteran host's chest, a recognition he couldn't quite place, an instinct honed by years of reading people that told him this young man was carrying something heavier than the typical teenage concerns about grades, friends, or weekend plans. The boy's handshake was firm and confident, accompanied by the kind of direct eye contact that spoke of someone who had learned early in life that respect was earned through actions rather than given freely, and that first impressions mattered in ways that could affect not just yourself, but the people depending on you. There was a formality in Marcus's posture, a careful attention to how he presented himself that suggested someone accustomed to being judged, evaluated, and found either worthy or wanting, based on factors often beyond his control. "So, Marcus," Steve had said, following his usual script with the warm paternal tone that had made him America's favorite television father figure, "tell us about yourself, young man. What do you want to be when you grow up? What's the dream that gets you up in the morning?" It was the standard question he asked all the younger contestants, usually resulting in answers that delighted audiences. Astronaut, professional athlete, video game designer, YouTube star, marine biologist, or any of the dozen other aspirations that represented the beautiful optimism of youth. But Marcus paused, his jaw working slightly as if he were choosing his words very carefully, weighing the difference between what people expected to hear and what was actually true. "Mr. Harvey, sir," Marcus began, his voice carrying a slight tremor that wasn't from stage fright but from something deeper and more complex. "I don't really think about what I want to be when I grow up anymore. I think about what I need to be right now, today, for my family. I think about being the kind of person who shows up when people are counting on me." The studio audience, expecting the lighthearted response that typically came from teenage contestants, fell into an unexpected silence that seemed to stretch across the soundstage like a blanket of anticipation. Steve's eyebrows raised slightly, his showman's instincts sensing that this wasn't going to be the typical family-friendly banter that filled the spaces between game questions. The game proceeded normally for the first 2 rounds, with both families settling into the comfortable rhythm of friendly competition that made Family Feud a beloved staple of American television. The Williams family was trailing behind the competing Rodriguez family from Phoenix, a multi-generational clan of small business owners who brought infectious energy and rapid-fire Spanish celebrations to every correct answer. Despite being behind on the scoreboard, the Williams family maintained high spirits, with Marcus successfully contributing to their efforts by guessing pizza as the number 3 answer for "name something people order for delivery," earning enthusiastic cheers from his relatives and a proud shout of "That's my baby" from grandmother Eleanor that was loud enough for the microphones to pick up and broadcast to the viewing audience. Marcus moved through the early rounds with a composure that impressed both his family and the production crew, answering questions with thoughtful consideration rather than the impulsive enthusiasm typical of teenage contestants. When asked to name something you find in a teacher's desk, he responded with extra pencils for students who forgot theirs, demonstrating not just knowledge, but empathy. For name something people do when they're nervous, he answered, take deep breaths and remember why they're there, showing a self-awareness that spoke of someone who had developed coping mechanisms for handling pressure. But it was during the preparation for the final fast money round that the carefully maintained equilibrium of the show began to shift in ways that no one in the studio could have anticipated. Due to a last-minute family emergency, Marcus's aunt had received a call that her own teenage son had been in a minor car accident and needed to be picked up from the hospital. The family's planned fast money participants were no longer available. This left Marcus as the only option to play alongside his Uncle Robert, a 45-year-old auto mechanic whose nervous energy was palpable as he realized that his 17-year-old nephew would be carrying a significant portion of their family's hopes for the $20,000 grand prize. As they prepared for the rapid-fire questioning that would determine their fate, Steve Harvey noticed something different about Marcus's demeanor. The playful nervousness that had characterized his earlier interactions had been replaced by an intense focus that seemed to age him before the cameras, as if the weight of representing his family's financial hopes had transformed him from teenager to adult in the span of a commercial break. His shoulders straightened with a determination that spoke of someone accustomed to carrying responsibilities, and his breathing became deliberate and controlled, like an athlete preparing for competition or a soldier preparing for battle. The first 4 fast money questions proceeded smoothly, with Marcus demonstrating the same thoughtful approach that had characterized his earlier answers, but now with an urgency that reflected the stakes involved. Name something you do when you can't sleep, Steve asked, and Marcus responded immediately. Pray. His answer carried the weight of experience, suggesting someone who had spent sleepless nights worried about problems that extended beyond homework and teenage social dynamics. Name a reason people call in sick to work, was the second question, and Marcus's response of family emergency came without hesitation, delivered with the certainty of someone who understood that family obligations sometimes superseded everything else, including financial stability. Name something that gets passed down from generation to generation, Steve continued, and Marcus's answer of recipes brought the first smile he'd shown during the fast money round, a momentary glimpse of the boy he still was underneath the premature adult responsibilities. Name something you'd find in a teenager's bedroom, prompted the response, homework, delivered with a slight grin that suggested Marcus's room was probably more organized and purpose-driven than most of his peers, a space where academic achievement took priority over typical teenage decorations and diversions. Then came the fifth and final question, the one that would determine whether the Williams family achieved their goal of winning the $20,000 that had brought them across the country to participate in this moment that represented so much more than a game show appearance. Steve Harvey, maintaining the energetic tempo that kept fast money rounds exciting, asked, "Name something a child might do to help their family." The question hung in the air between them, and Marcus's face underwent a transformation that was visible even to the cameras positioned 20 feet away, a shift so profound that it seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the studio. His shoulders straightened not with confidence but with the weight of truth. His breathing became deliberate and heavy, and for a moment that stretched beyond the television format's demands for quick responses, he looked not like a 17-year-old boy playing a game but like a man carrying the weight of the world. Someone who had lived the answer to this question in ways that most adults never would. "Work," he said quietly, but with absolute certainty that cut through the studio's noise like a knife through silence. The single word carried more emotional weight than entire speeches, delivered not with the casual confidence of his previous answers, but with the heavy knowledge of lived experience that spoke of early mornings, late nights, tired muscles, and sacrifices that no teenager should have to make. Steve Harvey, who had been energetically encouraging both contestants throughout the rapid-fire round, suddenly felt his showman persona crack slightly, his professional instincts overwhelmed by a human recognition that something profound had just occurred in front of the cameras. "Work," Steve repeated slowly, his voice losing some of its characteristic boom and taking on a more contemplative tone as he processed not just the answer, but the way it had been delivered. "That's a good answer, young man. That's a real good answer." But even as he spoke the words, Steve Harvey knew that good answer was inadequate to capture what he had just witnessed, the glimpse into a life that had required a child to become an adult long before graduation, prom, or college applications. The buzzer sounded with its familiar electronic tone, indicating that time was up and the fate of the Williams family was now in the hands of the survey responses that would determine whether Marcus's answer and the experiences behind it would be enough to push them over the 200-point threshold needed to win the grand prize. The family gathered around the scoreboard in the traditional Family Feud formation, their faces showing the mixture of hope and resignation that came with knowing they had done their best but couldn't control the outcome. Steve Harvey held the card containing their fate with hands that had opened thousands of similar results over his career, but this time felt different, weighted with the understanding that this wasn't just about prize money, but about validation for a young man who had revealed more about himself in one word than most contestants shared in entire episodes. The studio audience held its collective breath, sensing that they were witnessing something that transcended typical game show drama. "The Williams family," Steve announced, his voice carrying the gravity of a judge delivering a verdict, "scored 196 points. The number hung in the air like a physical presence, 4 points short of the goal that had brought this family across the country, 4 points short of the financial relief that would have validated Marcus's sacrifices and provided his grandmother with the security she deserved after years of putting family before her own comfort. In the typical Family Feud tradition, this would have been the moment for consolation, for thanking the family for their participation, for encouraging them to be proud of their effort, and for sending them home with the standard consolation prizes and the experience of being on television. But as Steve Harvey looked at Marcus Williams, seeing the way the teenager's jaw tightened with disappointment, that was clearly not for himself, but for his family, seeing the immediate way he placed a comforting hand on his grandmother's shoulder, despite his own feelings, something compelled the veteran host to break from the script that had guided him through thousands of similar moments. "Marcus," Steve said, stepping closer to the 17-year-old and abandoning the traditional host position behind the podium, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone despite the live studio audience and rolling cameras. "Can I ask you something, son?" The cameras continued recording, but the atmosphere in the studio had shifted from game show excitement to something more unpredictable and profound, as if everyone present sensed that the scripted portion of the show had ended and something real was about to begin. Marcus nodded without hesitation, his eyes never leaving Steve's face, demonstrating the same direct attention and respect that had characterized all his interactions throughout the taping. "Yes, sir, Mr. Harvey." "When you said work for that last question," Steve continued, his voice gentle but probing with the wisdom of a man who had navigated his own share of hardships and had developed the ability to recognize pain and strength in others, "it sounded like you were speaking from experience, like that word means something different to you than it might to other kids your age. How does a 17-year-old boy know about working to help his family in the way that your answer suggested?" The studio fell into a silence so complete that the gentle hum of the air conditioning system became audible, mixing with the distant sound of Los Angeles traffic filtering through the soundproofed walls and the barely perceptible whisper of camera operators adjusting their equipment to capture what was clearly becoming an unscripted moment of extraordinary television. Marcus Williams looked over at his grandmother Eleanor, who stood with the rest of the family at the contestant podium, her weathered hands clasped tightly together and her eyes already glistening with unshed tears, as if she knew exactly what confession was about to emerge from her grandson's lips and understood that this moment would change everything for their family, regardless of whether they had won or lost the game that had brought them to this stage. Eleanor Williams gave Marcus an encouraging nod, a gesture that contained within it 3 years of shared struggles, countless conversations about dignity and pride, and the unspoken understanding between a grandmother and grandson who had learned to face the world as a team against circumstances that neither of them had chosen, but both had accepted with remarkable grace. Her slight smile carried permission and pride, telling Marcus without words that she trusted him to share their truth in whatever way felt right to him, and that she would stand by whatever he chose to reveal about their life together. "Mr. Harvey," Marcus began, his voice steady but carrying an emotional weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the studio like a physical presence. "I've been working since I was 14 years old. Not because I wanted to buy video games or save for a car like most kids my age, but because my grandmother raised me after both my parents died in a car accident when I was 13, and her Social Security check of $867 a month isn't enough to cover everything we need to survive in a city where rent alone costs more than most people make in a week." The admission hit the studio like a physical force, rippling through the audience in waves of audible gasps, sharp intakes of breath, and the rustling of people shifting in their seats as they processed the magnitude of what they had just heard. Several audience members audibly whispered, "Oh my God," while others simply sat in stunned silence, their preconceptions about typical teenage concerns shattered by the reality of a young man who had been forced to navigate adult responsibilities while his peers worried about homework deadlines and weekend social plans. Steve Harvey, a man who had built his career on quick wit, perfect timing, and never being at a loss for words, found himself speechless for one of the few times in his professional life. His eyes moved from Marcus to Eleanor Williams, taking in the sight of this 72-year-old woman who was now openly crying, her hands pressed to her mouth as if trying to contain years of worry, sacrifice, and the overwhelming love that had driven every decision she had made since becoming the sole guardian of her grandson during what should have been her peaceful retirement years. "I work at Morrison's grocery store on 8 Mile Road," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger as if sharing the truth was lifting a weight from his shoulders that he had been carrying for far too long. "Stocking shelves and helping in the produce section every day after school from 4 o'clock until 10 o'clock at night. And then on weekends I help my neighbor Mr. Johnson with his landscaping business, moving mulch and planting flowers and trimming hedges for people who have the kind of houses that my grandmother and I see in magazines but never thought we'd be able to afford." Steve Harvey felt his throat tighten as he listened to Marcus describe a schedule that would exhaust most adults, a routine that left no time for the typical teenage experiences of sports, dating, hanging out with friends, or simply being young and carefree. The mental image of this 17-year-old boy working 10-hour shifts after full days of school, then spending his weekends doing physical labor, painted a picture of sacrifice and determination that humbled the veteran television host completely. "Everything I make," Marcus said, his eyes now bright with unshed tears but his voice remaining clear and strong. "Every single dollar from both jobs goes straight to helping my grandmother with the rent on our one-bedroom apartment, with groceries that we buy with coupons and careful planning, with the electric bill that we sometimes have to choose between paying in full or buying my school supplies, and with the bus fare that gets me to school and work because we can't afford to maintain a car in a city where reliable transportation can mean the difference between keeping a job and losing it." The raw honesty in Marcus's voice, combined with the specific details that painted a vivid picture of their daily struggles, created a moment that transcended entertainment and entered the realm of pure human connection. Every person in the studio, from audience members to camera operators to production assistants, found themselves confronting their own assumptions about poverty, sacrifice, and the resilience of the human spirit when faced with circumstances that would break many people. "That's why I wanted to be on this show so badly, Mr. Harvey," Marcus continued, turning to look directly at Steve Harvey with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "Not for the fame or the chance to be on television, not because I thought it would be fun or exciting, but because $20,000 would mean that my grandmother could rest a little bit, maybe not worry so much about whether the lights are going to get turned off next month, maybe be able to buy her blood pressure medication without having to choose between that and groceries, maybe even be able to fix the heater in our apartment so she doesn't have to sleep with 3 blankets when winter comes." Steve Harvey, who had interviewed thousands of contestants over his years in television, had heard many stories of hardship and hope, but had never encountered anything quite like this combination of mature acceptance, selfless love, and quiet dignity in the face of circumstances that no teenager should have to navigate. The raw honesty in Marcus's voice, the complete absence of self-pity or resentment, and the clear prioritization of his grandmother's well-being over his own comfort created a moment that would be remembered not just by those present in the studio, but by everyone who would eventually see this episode. "Son," Steve said, his voice noticeably thick with emotion as he struggled to maintain his professional composure while processing the full impact of what he had just heard. "How long have you been carrying this weight? How long have you been the man of the house when you should still be figuring out how to be a boy?" The question hung in the air between them, highlighting the fundamental tragedy of a childhood cut short by necessity and the remarkable strength of a young person who had risen to meet responsibilities that would challenge adults with decades more life experience. As Steve asked the question, he found himself thinking about his own children, about the security and opportunities he had been able to provide them, about the luxury of allowing them to remain children throughout their teenage years, and feeling a profound respect for this young man who was handling adult responsibilities with such grace and dignity. "Since I was about 15, I guess," Marcus replied with a slight shrug that was heartbreaking in its casual acceptance of a reality that most people would find overwhelming, as if discussing carrying the financial weight of a household was as normal as talking about homework or weekend plans. "At first, Grandma didn't want me to work. She said school was my job and she'd figure out the rest, that she had raised 5 children of her own and knew how to make ends meet. But I could see how tired she was all the time. How she'd skip meals sometimes to make sure I had enough food. How she'd wear the same 3 dresses over and over because she was spending her clothing money on school supplies for me." The audience listened in complete silence as Marcus painted a picture of poverty that was both specific and universal, describing the daily calculations and sacrifices that characterized life for millions of American families who worked hard but still struggled to meet basic needs. His matter-of-fact tone made his words even more powerful, demonstrating a maturity and perspective that came from lived experience rather than theoretical understanding. "So I told her that helping family isn't a burden, it's what we do," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned life's most important lessons through necessity rather than instruction. "She taught me that family means showing up for each other, especially when things get hard. She taught me that love isn't just a feeling, it's action, it's sacrifice. It's choosing to put someone else's needs before your own comfort. So when I started working, I told her it wasn't because I felt sorry for her, or because I thought she couldn't handle things, but because I wanted to be the kind of man who takes care of the people he loves. The camera operators, following their training to capture every emotional moment, zoomed in on Steve Harvey's face as the full impact of Marcus's words settled over him like a revelation. Here was a man who had overcome his own struggles with poverty and family hardship during his childhood in rural West Virginia, who understood intimately the sacrifices that love demanded and the way financial stress could age people beyond their years, suddenly faced with a living embodiment of resilience and maturity that humbled him completely and reminded him of his own mother's sacrifices decades earlier. Steve Harvey turned away from Marcus for a moment, ostensibly to check the scorecards and gather his thoughts, but the cameras caught the moment when he removed his glasses and quickly wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture that was both profoundly human and completely uncharacteristic for a man known for his polished television presence. When he turned back to face the Williams family, his composure was intact, but something fundamental had shifted in his demeanor, transforming him from game show host to something more personal and invested. "Marcus," Steve said, his voice now carrying a different quality entirely, less polished television personality, and more mentor and father figure speaking from his own experience with hardship and determination. "I need to ask you something else, and I want you to be completely honest with me the way you've been honest about everything else. When you're at school, when you're with your friends, when you're in situations where you're supposed to be a regular teenager, do they know about your situation? Do they understand what you're dealing with when you go home every day?" The question seemed to catch Marcus off guard for the first time since the conversation had begun, forcing him to consider not just his family responsibilities, but the social isolation that often accompanied the kind of premature adulthood that circumstances had thrust upon him. He looked down at his feet for a moment, then back up at Steve with a vulnerability that made him look every bit his 17 years rather than the mature young man who had been speaking with such wisdom about sacrifice and responsibility. "Most of them don't know, Mr. Harvey," Marcus admitted, his voice becoming softer and more hesitant as he ventured into emotional territory that was clearly more difficult for him to navigate than discussions of work schedules and financial pressures. "And the ones who do know about my situation, sometimes they treat me different afterward, like they feel sorry for me or like they don't know what to say when I can't hang out on weekends because I'm working, or when I can't go to movies or restaurants because I don't have spending money like they do." Steve Harvey felt something crack open in his chest at those words, recognizing the particular pain of adolescent isolation that came from being different, from carrying burdens that peers couldn't understand or relate to. The social challenges of teenage years were difficult enough without the added complexity of adult responsibilities and financial pressures that set someone apart from their age group in fundamental ways. "But Mr. Harvey," Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength again as he moved back to more comfortable emotional ground, "I want you to know that I don't want people to feel sorry for me. I'm not ashamed of my life or my family or the choices we've had to make. I'm proud of what I do for my grandmother. I'm proud of her for raising me the way she did, for teaching me values that I see some of my friends at school don't have. Sometimes I think my situation has made me stronger, made me understand what really matters in life, made me appreciate things that other people take for granted." The wisdom in those words, coming from someone who hadn't yet reached his 18th birthday, created another wave of silence throughout the studio, as everyone present grappled with the maturity and perspective that Marcus was demonstrating. His ability to find positive meaning in difficult circumstances, to frame hardship as character building rather than victimization, spoke to an inner strength that was both inspiring and heartbreaking in its premature necessity. Steve Harvey felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders as he realized that this moment, this conversation, this unprecedented break from the show's normal format, was being broadcast to millions of viewers who would be as moved and challenged by Marcus's story as everyone in the studio clearly was. The power of television to illuminate human stories, to create connection and understanding across different circumstances and backgrounds, had never felt more real or more important to him than it did in this moment. "Marcus," Steve said, walking slowly toward the teenager with the deliberate movement of someone who had made a decision that would change the trajectory of this entire experience, "I want you to know something, and I want everyone watching this show to understand what I'm about to say. In all my years doing television, interviewing people from every walk of life, meeting families who represent the best and worst of human experience. I have never, and I mean never, encountered someone your age with the wisdom, strength, and character that you've just demonstrated for all of us." The studio audience began to stir with anticipation, sensing that Steve Harvey was building toward something significant, something that would transcend the typical boundaries of game show conclusions. His voice carried the authority and gravitas of someone who had earned the right to make pronouncements about character and strength through his own life experiences and professional observations. "You see, Marcus," Steve continued, his voice growing stronger and more passionate as he spoke from the heart rather than from any script or professional training. "When I was growing up in West Virginia, in a house with no indoor plumbing, sleeping on floors some nights when there wasn't enough money for proper beds, walking miles to school because we couldn't afford transportation, I thought I understood what hardship looked like. My mother, Eloise Harvey, worked multiple jobs to keep food on our table, cleaning houses for white families during the day and taking in laundry at night, and I watched her sacrifice everything she had for her children." The personal revelation from Steve Harvey created a new dynamic in the studio, as audience members and crew alike realized they were witnessing not just a game show host responding to a contestant, but one human being, recognizing profound similarity in another's experience and choosing to honor that connection publicly. "But you, son," Steve said, pointing directly at Marcus with a gesture that was both accusatory and celebratory, "you're doing something that I didn't have the maturity or wisdom to do at your age. You're not just enduring hardship, you're not just surviving difficult circumstances, you're transforming adversity into purpose, you're turning sacrifice into strength, and you're doing it with a grace and dignity that puts most adults to shame." Marcus stood perfectly still during Steve's speech, his eyes locked on the veteran host's face, and for the first time since the conversation had begun, tears started to well up in his eyes. Not tears of sadness or embarrassment, but tears of recognition and relief, the profound emotional release that comes when someone truly sees and understands your struggle, when your efforts and sacrifices are acknowledged and validated by someone whose opinion matters. Eleanor Williams, still standing with the rest of the family at the contestant podium, was now crying openly, her hands clutched to her chest as if she were trying to hold her heart together while watching her grandson receive the recognition and respect that she had always known he deserved but had never seen him receive from the outside world. She had spent 3 years watching Marcus grow up too fast, carry too much weight, and maintain a strength that both amazed and broke her heart. And hearing this respected public figure acknowledge what she had always known about her grandson felt like a validation of every difficult decision they had made together. "Mr. Harvey," Marcus said, his voice slightly shaky now as the emotional weight of the moment began to overwhelm the composure he had maintained throughout his confession. "I just want to say that my grandmother is the real hero in our family. She didn't have to take me in when my parents died. She was 69 years old and looking forward to a peaceful retirement. Maybe traveling a little bit, maybe spending time with her friends from church, maybe just relaxing after raising 5 children of her own, and working for 47 years as a teacher." The specificity of Marcus's details about his grandmother's sacrifice painted a vivid picture of a woman who had chosen love over convenience, family obligation over personal comfort, and the overwhelming responsibility of raising a teenager during what should have been her golden years of freedom and rest. "She could have let the state handle my placement," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke about the woman who had shaped his character and values. "Could have chosen the easier path that everyone would have understood, and nobody would have blamed her for. But she didn't hesitate, not for a single day. She chose love over convenience, and she's been showing me every day since then what it means to put family first, what it means to sacrifice without complaining, what it means to find joy and purpose even when circumstances aren't what you planned or hoped for." Steve Harvey felt his throat tighten as Marcus's words hit him with the force of absolute truth and profound gratitude. He turned to look at Eleanor Williams, this 72-year-old woman who had taken on the monumental responsibility of raising a teenager while living on a fixed income that barely covered her own basic needs, and he saw in her face the same determination, love, and quiet strength that had driven his own mother through decades of hardship and sacrifice. "Mrs. Williams," Steve called out, his voice now carrying across the studio with the authority of someone who had made a decision that would surprise everyone present. "Would you mind joining us up here for a moment? I think it's time for America to meet the woman who raised this extraordinary young man." Eleanor Williams looked surprised and slightly overwhelmed, but she made her way slowly across the studio floor toward where Steve and Marcus were standing, her movements showing the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to navigate the world with dignity, despite physical limitations and financial constraints. As she approached, Steve could see the weariness in her posture, the slight stiffness that spoke of years of hard work and constant worry, but also the unmistakable bearing of a woman who had never allowed circumstances to break her spirit or compromise her values. "Mrs. Williams," Steve said, taking her weathered hand gently in both of his with the reverence typically reserved for meeting someone of great importance or achievement. "I need you to know something that I don't think anyone has ever told you properly. What you've done, raising this young man, instilling in him these values, creating a person of such character and strength and wisdom, that's not just grandparenting, that's not just family obligation, that's heroism in its purest form. That's the kind of love that changes the world, one person at a time, one generation at a time." Eleanor Williams looked up at Steve Harvey through her tears, her face showing the overwhelming emotion of a woman who had spent years questioning whether she was doing enough, whether her love and guidance were sufficient to prepare her grandson for a world that often seemed stacked against young people like him, whether her sacrifice was making any real difference in his life and future prospects. "Mr. Harvey," Eleanor said, her voice soft but clear, carrying the same dignity and strength that had obviously been passed down to her grandson, "Marcus is my heart walking around outside my body. Everything I've done, every choice I've made, every sacrifice that you're calling heroic, I would do 1,000 times over without hesitation. He's given my life purpose and meaning in these years when I thought my most important work was behind me. If anyone should be doing the thanking, it should be me thanking him for allowing me to be part of his journey." It was at that moment that Steve Harvey did something that no one in the studio expected, something that had never happened in the entire history of Family Feud, something that would be talked about and remembered long after the episode aired, and the initial emotional impact had settled into television legend. He turned away from the Williams family, walked past the host podium where he had stood for thousands of episodes, and headed directly toward the exit of the studio with the determined stride of a man who had suddenly understood exactly what needed to happen next. The cameras followed him automatically, confusion evident among the crew as this departure from script and protocol was completely unprecedented in the show's long history. Audience members murmured to each other in bewilderment, wondering if there was a technical problem or emergency that was causing this unusual interruption to the show's format. But Steve Harvey wasn't walking away from the family or abandoning the moment. He was walking toward something greater, something that transcended the normal boundaries of television entertainment and entered the realm of real-world action and meaningful change. He stopped near the studio exit, pulled out his phone and made a call that would be heard clearly through his wireless microphone, ensuring that everyone in the studio and everyone who would eventually watch the episode would witness what happened next. "Sarah," he said into the phone, speaking to his longtime personal assistant with the urgency of someone who had suddenly seen a way to use his success and influence for something more important than entertainment. "I need you to stop whatever you're doing and listen carefully. I want you to call the bank right now, today, this minute, and set up a college fund for a young man named Marcus Williams. Start it with $50,000 from my personal account and make sure it's structured so that he can access it for educational expenses, books, tuition, housing, whatever he needs to pursue higher education without having to work full-time jobs that interfere with his studies." The studio erupted in gasps, scattered applause, and emotional outbursts as the audience realized they were witnessing not just a generous gesture, but a life-changing intervention that would alter the trajectory of Marcus Williams' future in ways that extended far beyond the game show prize money they had originally competed for. But Steve Harvey wasn't finished with his phone call, and his voice continued to carry clearly through the studio as he outlined additional plans that demonstrated the depth of his commitment to making a real difference in the Williams family's circumstances. "Also, Sarah," he continued, his voice growing stronger and more determined with each instruction, I want you to reach out to our contacts at the major grocery store chains in the Detroit area. See if we can help Marcus find a position that pays significantly better than his current job and offers more flexible hours that work around his school schedule. Maybe even a management training program that could give him valuable experience for his future career. The specificity of Steve's instructions revealed that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment emotional response, but a carefully considered intervention based on his understanding of what the Williams family actually needed to improve their circumstances in meaningful and sustainable ways. "And Sarah," Steve said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who had made a decision that would have lasting impact. "Call the network executives immediately. I want to personally invite this family back for a special episode where we can tell their story properly, where we can give Marcus and Mrs. Williams the platform they deserve to inspire other families who are facing similar challenges, and where we can show America what real strength and character look like when they're tested by adversity." Steve Harvey walked back to the center of the studio, where Marcus and Eleanor Williams stood in stunned silence, their faces showing the overwhelming mixture of disbelief, gratitude, and emotional overload that comes when life changes dramatically and unexpectedly in the space of a few minutes. The teenager who had been so composed throughout his confession was now openly crying, not from sadness or embarrassment, but from the overwhelming realization that his sacrifices had been seen, understood, and honored in ways that would change everything for his family. "Marcus," Steve said, placing both hands firmly on the young man's shoulders in a gesture that was both paternal and respectful, "I walked off this set because I needed to take immediate action. Your story, your character, your love for your grandmother, your willingness to sacrifice your teenage years for family responsibility. It reminded me why I'm in this position in the first place. Not just to entertain people, not just to make them laugh or compete for prizes, but to recognize and celebrate the extraordinary human spirit when I encounter it, and to use whatever influence I have to make a real difference in people's lives." The audience was on their feet now, applauding not just for the generosity they had witnessed, but for the authenticity of the moment, for the way television had been transformed from mere entertainment into a vehicle for meaningful human connection and positive change. This wasn't scripted television designed to manipulate emotions for ratings. This was real life intersecting with the power of media to create genuine transformation in people's circumstances. "But Mr. Harvey," Marcus said through his tears, his voice mixing gratitude with the confusion of someone whose entire reality had just shifted in ways he was still trying to process. "We didn't even win the game. We came here hoping to win money for my family, and we lost by 4 points. How can you be doing all this for us when we didn't even accomplish what we came here to do?" Steve Harvey smiled then, the first genuine smile he had worn since Marcus's confession had begun, an expression that was both joyful and profound as he prepared to deliver the final lesson of this extraordinary encounter. "Son," Steve said, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned life's most important lessons through his own journey from poverty to success, "you didn't lose anything today. You won something far more valuable than $20,000, far more important than any game show prize. You won the respect and admiration of everyone in this studio, everyone who will watch this show, and everyone who will hear your story for years to come. You've reminded us all what true strength looks like, what real character means, and what love in action actually accomplishes." Eleanor Williams stepped forward then, her voice strong despite her tears as she prepared to speak on behalf of her family and express gratitude that went far beyond words. "Mr. Harvey, I don't know how to properly thank you for what you're doing for Marcus, for what you're doing for our family. But I want you to know that even if you hadn't made those phone calls, even if nothing had changed about our circumstances, today would still be one of the most special days of our lives. Because you saw my grandson, really saw him for who he is, and you recognized what I've known all along, that he's extraordinary." Steve Harvey nodded with complete understanding, recognizing in Eleanor Williams the same fierce pride and protective love that had characterized his own mother's approach to raising children under difficult circumstances. "Mrs. Williams, the honor has been entirely mine. Marcus has taught me something today about grace under pressure, about putting family first without resentment, about finding strength and purpose in the face of adversity. Those are lessons I needed to be reminded of. Lessons that will make me a better person, a better father, and a better human being. As the cameras prepared to capture the final moments of what had become the most emotionally powerful episode in Family Feud history, Steve Harvey addressed the viewing audience directly, speaking not as a game show host following a script, but as a man who had been profoundly moved by what he had experienced and wanted to share the impact with everyone who would witness this moment. "Folks," he said, his voice carrying the gravity of someone delivering a message that extended far beyond entertainment. "Today started as just another episode of Family Feud, another opportunity for families to compete for prizes and have some fun on television. But sometimes life gives us moments that are bigger than entertainment, bigger than games, bigger than prizes. Today I met a young man who reminded me that heroism isn't about grand gestures or public recognition or dramatic rescues that make headlines." He paused, looking back at Marcus and Eleanor Williams, who were still standing together, processing the life-changing events of the past hour while trying to comprehend how a game show appearance had transformed into something that would alter their family's future permanently. "True heroism," Steve continued, "is about showing up every day, doing what needs to be done without complaint, putting love before convenience, and finding strength in circumstances that would break many people. Marcus Williams represents the best of what we can be as human beings. He's faced challenges that would overwhelm many adults, and he's responded with maturity, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to family that should inspire all of us." Steve's voice grew stronger and more passionate as he delivered what had become not just a conclusion to a game show, but a testament to the power of human resilience and the importance of recognizing and supporting the quiet heroes who walk among us every day. His grandmother, Eleanor Williams, has shown us what it means to love unconditionally, to sacrifice without resentment, and to find purpose and meaning in circumstances that she never chose but embraced completely out of love for her family. Together, they represent the kind of strength, character, and love that our world desperately needs more of. The final moments of the episode captured Steve Harvey embracing both Marcus and Eleanor Williams, three people from vastly different backgrounds united by a shared understanding of what family, sacrifice, and love really mean when they're tested by real-world circumstances. The cameras lingered on their faces, showing the tears, the smiles, and the profound human connection that had transformed a television studio into a place where lives were changed and hearts were opened. "This show will air," Steve concluded, "but this moment will live with me forever. Marcus, Eleanor, you've changed me today. You've reminded me of who I was, who I am, and who I want to continue to be. You've shown me the power of love in action, the beauty of sacrifice without selfishness, and the strength that comes from facing adversity together. Thank you for that gift, and thank you for allowing America to witness what real heroism looks like when it's lived out in the daily choices of ordinary people doing extraordinary things." As the cameras stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, Steve Harvey remained with the Williams family for another hour, talking not about television or fame or the mechanics of the assistants he had arranged, but about dreams, education, and the future that was now wide open for a 17-year-old boy who had shown the world what true character looks like under pressure. The episode that eventually aired became the most watched in Family Feud history, not because of the game that was played, but because of the humanity that was revealed, the connection that was made, and the reminder that television at its best can be a force for recognizing and celebrating the extraordinary spirit that exists in ordinary people when they choose love, sacrifice, and family above their own comfort and convenience. Hey, my friends, help me by subscribing to the channel so we can reach 1,000 subscribers, even if you're watching from your TV or computer. Your subscription makes all the difference, and the algorithm will help you see more amazing stories. Leave a like or an emoji in the comments and be part of this growth.